Thanks, Alex. Hello, I'm Nic Carter. I invest in Bitcoin businesses, and I'm here to talk about the prehistory of Bitcoin. So when Alex asked me to come and do the talk and talk about how the people that built Bitcoin and the systems that support Bitcoin and historically went in to the construction of Bitcoin, how they were activists, I thought to myself, well, of course they were. The Cypherpunks, that was an activist, ideological, political movement. Bitcoin is a continuation of that. And so what I'd like to do today is dive into some of the remarkable individuals that laid the grounds for the construction of Bitcoin as a viable system, and talk a little bit about how political activism went into these prior systems and, the battles that they waged. Which I think we're going to see a reprisal of some of those battles today. So I originally was planning on building a detailed timeline, but these guys, Ansel Lindner and BTC Markets, did a great job, so I'm just stealing theirs. So a lot of people think Bitcoin is this sort of sui generis thing that just sort of popped out of the ether, fully formed. But the truth is that a huge number of individual components came together to build the system. Those components were built by human beings, and those humans did it out of a very specific vision for what the world should be. And a lot of this, I would say, the modern genesis of modern cryptography came with the academic discovery of public key cryptography for civilian purposes. And in the 70s, public key cryptography, the thing that underlies Bitcoin's public key infrastructure, that was a technology that the military and the government controlled exclusively. And it had not really been discovered for civilian or academic purposes. And Whitfield Diffie came around and realized that you could build these kinds of curves and that you could build these public key systems. And that was kind of a breakthrough. It was a Promethean moment. It seized power from exclusively the state to, wow, academics and software developers, regular folks eventually will be able to use this. And that powered a lot of the cypherpunk movement, which was basically seizing this power from the state, and that was not without complaints. They fought back for a number of years and publishing it. And in 78, Rivest, Shamir, and Adelman, RSA, which you've probably heard of, they productized it. And Diffie, Whitfield Diffie, he described himself as an iconoclast. But this wasn't part of some libertarian right-wing movement. He considered himself a leftist. Right? What he believed was that cryptography was a tool to protect individuals and allow them to defend themselves against a powerful adversary. So fast forward to David Chaum, who is probably one of the most important folks in the history of digital cash. Of course, David Chaum's system, Digicash, was a digital cash anonymous system. It was centralized in nature. There's a corporation. There's effectively a bank that processed the transactions, but David Chaum's entire construction of that software system was a deeply ideological project. He believed that we were on the cusp of what he called a dossier state, in which all of our footprint, all of our activities would be surveilled, which obviously has come true now. And that was what he sort of deeply, deeply feared. And he felt he had to create something in order to stop that reality from occurring. So I've got a few of his quotes from this remarkable paper that he wrote in 1985. The foundation is being laid for a dossier society in which computers would be used to infer individuals' lifestyles, habits, whereabouts, and associations. And remember, he's writing this in 85. And he created Digicash, which was a fully anonymous digital cash system, in an effort to grant people the anonymity that he felt that we would lose as the world became increasingly computerized and surveilled. And so, the important thing to understand is that these cryptographic innovations they had, political motives. And those motives were protecting individuals from the state and from corporations. And of course, we now see the consequence of that in places where you have these CBDCs and social credit systems. The cypherpunks, and I'm not sure Chaum would describe himself as a cypherpunks, but the antecedents to Bitcoin, the forefathers of Bitcoin, they understood the direction we were heading in, and they found transactional anonymity to be absolutely paramount. So moving on, we had the formation of this movement called the Cypherpunks, and they actually had, pretty definite political agendas, and they tended to be more on the libertarian or even anarchist side. And the Cypherpunks was a mailing list, which is of course where the Bitcoin announcement was hosted. That's where Satoshi chose to make the announcement of Bitcoin in October 2008. So it was a mailing list, but it was also a physical meetup in San Francisco. Started in the 90s by Eric Hughes and Tim May. And I'm going to give you a couple of their quotes here to give an introduction to what they believed. But, the basics of cypherpunk thought is that we were in the 90s and very much are today at the cusp of this transition to a society that is increasingly surveilled, that's increasingly computerized, and there will be enormous returns to scale for the state as they're able to surveil all of our behavior. And this was a change, right? We had physical cash for the longest time that's fully confidential, fully private. As you move to digitized systems, that potentially gives the state enormous power. However, at the same time, there are technological innovations in cryptography and software that made the cypherpunks optimistic that we could move to a model of pseudonymity, where people wouldn't have to disclose their real human identity with every transaction they made. And that was sort of the cornerstone of cypherpunk thought. Potentially, we could move to a world where people build reputation on a pseudonymous basis. And of course, we see this today in sort of the crypto space. And that was what they foresaw. Their other stance on this was that asking the state nicely to protect your privacy was mostly futile, or it just wasn't, particularly high leverage activity. And, it hasn't historically really worked that well, asking governments not to surveil us. They do it anyway. So what they felt was the most, high leverage and best approach was to build code and deploy systems that would protect individuals' privacy. So, that was their political approach, not through electoral processes, not through lobbying the state, but by developing, user-friendly, widely deployed at scale software projects using cryptography that allow people to, send information freely and, in an encrypted way, and potentially to transact with each other online. And so that was the, preferred approach. And so, there's this famous phrase, cypherpunks write code. The idea is that you write code instead of trying to ask nicely, because asking doesn't work. And, they engage in civil disobedience, and I'll talk you through a couple of those examples. But, the thing to understand is that the technological processes, those are political, they're embedded with these political objectives. So the cypherpunks, of course, they were software developers and cryptographers, but they were activists too. So a lot of cypherpunk thought, there's a famous manifesto from this guy, Chuck Hamill, 1987. He compares cryptography to crossbows. And what crossbows did in the feudal society was they massively leveled the playing field because regular folks could operate a crossbow. Most regular folks couldn't just operate a longbow because you had to have years of training to do that. But basically anyone could operate a crossbow. So crossbows were profoundly destabilizing to sort of the feudal order because they, eliminated the asymmetries that existed between, mounted combat and sort of peasants. And in fact, crossbows were outlawed in a lot of the case. And cryptography is kind of the same way. It means that virtually anyone with cheap consumer software can communicate online in an encrypted way and potentially transact online privately. Giving you, power, stealing power back from these centralized authorities that previously wielded it. And so Chuck Hamill had the same view. I don't disparage the concept of political action, but he doesn't believe that it's the most cost-effective path towards increasing freedom in our time. So rather than beseeching the state to please not enslave, plunder, or constrain us, I propose a network spreading the technologies by which we may seize freedom for ourselves. So this was the cypherpunk approach. This was the cornerstone of their thought. Deploy code as a standard of activism. And this is what they did. And so Tim May, very famously wrote the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto. And he felt that, cryptography was on the cusp of unseating these power structures. And he described it as a revolution. The notion of using cryptographic techniques for digital cash, for secure messaging, he felt it was a revolution. Maybe it is. Eric Hughes was another one of the early cypherpunks, felt that you can't just merely expect the government to grant you privacy out of their beneficence. We must defend our own privacy if we expect to have any. So their model for activism involved writing and deploying these systems, although it could well be the case that the timelines weren't exactly what they expected. And of course, cypherpunks write code. So Phil Zimmermann is one of the most interesting characters in this whole story because Phil Zimmermann was prosecuted by the US government for publishing software. And it wasn't malicious. It wasn't a worm. It wasn't software that was designed to destroy anything. It was simply software that allowed people to communicate via email securely. And I'm sure many of you have used it. PGP, pretty good privacy. And PGP was the first major sort of consumer-grade application of public key cryptography for the purposes of secure email communication. And when Phil Zimmermann published it in the early 90s, he was prosecuted by the US government for violating their munitions export regulation because cryptography was considered a military concern. And it took the government a long time to realize, wow, the toothpaste is out of the tube. You can't put it back in. The cat is out of the bag. There's no way to unpublish. There's no way for the public to unlearn these secrets of public key cryptography. But they didn't go down without a fight. They did prosecute him. And it took people like Adam Back, spreading PGP in physical books and on T-shirts to demonstrate the absurdity of the government's position on this. This was civil disobedience, using and deploying these crypto systems simply to encrypt email communication was against the law. And during the Clinton administration, there was another scandal where they tried to enforce the usage of this thing called the Clipper chip, which would insert a backdoor into encryption in all consumer devices. And so, the government fought this war. I mean, it wasn't a hot war, it wasn't a kinetic war, but they fought a war against academics and software developers and engineers in an attempt to stifle the usage of mere cryptography. And I suspect we're going to see much the same thing when it comes to cryptocurrency this time around. And I think we would do a lot to learn from these people that were on the front lines last time. And there's actually a great book on this called Crypto, I think, by Stephen Levy, which is a really excellent history. So moving on, we actually get into, in the late 90s, we get into some of these digital cash projects. Of course, you have Nick Szabo with BitGold, you have Wei Dai with B-Money, and Adam Back's Hashcash, of course. And I think most of these people probably describe themselves as cypherpunks. So Hashcash, early 2000s, this is one of the key things that Bitcoin is built on. The hashing is central to all of the mining. And in 2003, Adam Back realized that creating cryptographic hashes was potentially a way to create sort of a unit of economic value on the internet. Adam Back was absolutely one of those cypherpunks, publishing the code for PGP and spreading it far and wide. Wei Dai in 1998 published a predecessor to Bitcoin, which is probably one of the most similar systems to Bitcoin 10 years before Bitcoin emerged. A lot of those ideas, you can find them in Bitcoin, whether or not Satoshi knew about it at the time. So Wei Dai was a believer in crypto anarchy. He said in crypto anarchy, the government is not temporarily destroyed, but permanently forbidden and permanently unnecessary. He says the threat of violence is impotent because violence is impossible, because individuals that are transacting can't be linked to their true names and physical locations. And now, this may seem like a utopian view, to have a society where commerce and transactions are based on pseudonymity instead of real names. But this was the vision. This was the vision of the cypherpunks. And now with Nick Szabo with BitGold, that's another predecessor project to Bitcoin. Again, lots of those ideas in BitGold are present in Bitcoin. He compares it to a monetary network. And so this is where you start to see divergences in cypherpunk thought. Some of the cypherpunks were really focused on digital transactions. So the Chaumian private confidential cash transactions. But Nick Szabo, again, one of the most titanic figures in pre-Bitcoin thought, starts thinking to himself, well, what if we had more of a monetary focus? what if we created a monetary network that the government couldn't debase with inflation? And big gold, the clue is in the name. He thought of it as a gold-like thing. And so his focus started to be a little bit different from the Chaumian cash. David Chaum was trying to have dollar-denominated cash transactions. Meanwhile, there was another faction of cypherpunks that thought to themselves, what if we created an independent monetary network where people could store their savings in a device that is outside of the dollar, that's outside of sovereign currencies? And so, this is an important thing to remember. The cypherpunks may have had similar aims. They may have believed in privacy and pseudonymity and the right for individuals to transact freely outside of the purview of governments, but they weren't homogenous. They weren't all the same. And a lot of those early fractures emerged later in the history of Bitcoin, where we had the scaling debate and we had all these wars within Bitcoin. So lastly, this brings us to Hal Finney, one of the earliest developers on Bitcoin. I'm going to publish all these slides, by the way, and Satoshi Nakamoto, of course. And Hal Finney, one of the earliest developers on Bitcoin, probably the first outside contributor ever, wrote this incredible essay in 1994 where he demonstrated that he was maybe a little more pragmatic than some of the other cypherpunks, right? He felt that maybe we actually should compromise with the government a little bit. Maybe we're not going to be able to step outside of society and create this alternative society based on cryptography and pseudonymity. And so again, some of these guys were, true radicals and true activists in the genuine sense of the term. And some of them felt that crypto systems were a bargaining strategy so that we could seize power back for individuals from strong central authority. But, maybe we're not going to live in this sort of crypto utopian, paradise. And Hal, pointed out the very real cost of being an activist in this sense. He pointed out that the Clipper proposal, which was this Clinton administration attempt to backdoor cryptography and encryption, was defeated through politics as opposed to mere technological development. He pointed out the difficulties Phil Zimmermann faced for publishing code. And so even though Hal Finney, was a true sort of cypherpunk in the genuine sense, he felt that we couldn't just completely withdraw from society. So again, the cypherpunk's not a homogenous group, but certainly some key themes there. And then of course Satoshi. Satoshi was an individual of few words. Satoshi was very sparing with their political statements, and it's hard to sort of infer what Satoshi believed in, but I think it's completely unambiguous that Satoshi intended Bitcoin as an ideological political project. And that's not political in the partisan sense of red versus blue, right? This is political in the sense that Bitcoin is imbued with definite aims and objectives, and it's maybe up to us to discover what they are. I think the most stirring political statement that Satoshi ever made was, someone on the mailing list or Bitcoin Talk said, you're not going to find a solution to political problems in cryptography. Satoshi responds, yes, but we can win a major battle in the arms race and gain a new territory of freedom for several years. So Satoshi saw free digital cash transactions as a tool of freedom. Mentioned a number of times that, he felt Bitcoin was sort of attractive to the libertarian viewpoint. But again, Satoshi didn't really give us that many clues. I think it's clear that Bitcoin is embedded with some of these values. Of course, Satoshi published the white paper on the Cypherpunk mailing list in the first place, certainly signaling, an affinity, and, made a number of political comments. But it's kind of interesting because Bitcoin does a lot of things at the same time. So on the one hand, it's a cash-like transaction system. So potentially it's a way to transact online with more anonymity. And people like the Lightning folks are working on ways to make it even more anonymous. But at the same time, Bitcoin is also a monetary phenomenon. It's this idea that the supply of money should be non-discretionary. That means the supply of money should not be determined by a government or by PhDs at the Federal Reserve. The supply of money should be fixed and set by an algorithm and then not changed thereafter. And so Bitcoin has these many different ideas within the system. Some people are really attracted to the monetary facets. Some people really like the fact that the monetary rules do not change. If you were a gold bug, you probably like that part of the system. some people, on the other hand, really like the transactional privacy element, or relative privacy. It's not perfect, as we know. And then some people like the programmability, or just think it's an interesting alternative payment system for the internet. And so Bitcoin has these multiple different and oftentimes clashing ideas that are held within it. And this means that we have these civil wars in the Bitcoin community, but those trace back to different ideas, different strains of cypherpunk thought. So if on the cash-like side, you've got, effectively the David Chaumian thought around we need to create digital cash instruments for transacting online, but it doesn't really matter if it's dollar denominated or something else. And then on the other side, you've got people that think, well, full nodes are absolutely paramount. We need to maintain the system to be decentralized as possible. And these ideas clash, and they do. So it's kind of an interesting concept to try and reason about sort of the activist strands that are present within Bitcoin today, because as far as we know, there's 50 to 100 million people worldwide that use Bitcoin. And we've heard some of their incredible stories here today. But not all those people agree with each other. And certainly they don't have, they don't share the same political objectives. But of course, to use the system is a political act because the system is so disruptive and potentially destabilizing to sovereign currencies. And so it's hard to identify, what the ideological objective of Bitcoin is today, because people see in Bitcoin so many different things and they disagree with each other all the time. And even the cypherpunks, the predecessors and forerunners to Bitcoin, disagreed with each other a lot. So I'm going to wrap it up there, and maybe we can take some questions too.
Thanks, Nick. That was awesome. I really appreciate the background. It's now my pleasure to invite up Guy, who we call the voice of Bitcoin, because he devotes a lot of his time reading a lot of the articles that people produce in this space. And Guy's going to help moderate a conversation with Nick until about 3:40, and we'll move on to our next topic. So welcome, Guy.
Cool. One of those things I've read on a Bitcoin Audible podcast is about 12 of this guy's works, maybe. I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to just, if you had to sum up what to you the cypherpunk ideal is, like what makes cypherpunkism different from essentially other activism or whatever, like what's that core, as simply as possible, what is that in your search, I guess?
I think the clearest statement is cypherpunk ideology is simply cypherpunk's right code, which is to say that the main mode of expression, of political expression, is the creation and deployment of software systems that allow people to seize more power for themselves relative to powerful adversaries.
Gotcha. I essentially, like, without a doubt, because what kind of the foundation of like cypherpunkism, you talked about it in this piece, was that they were never there to ask permission. And there's this kind of foundational idea that to think that you can ask permission for freedom is to abuse the idea of freedom. If you're having to ask permission, it's not real freedom. It's like a free range chicken. Sure, you have permission to wander around because your owners say so, but if you're not actually taking it, if it's not your responsibility and your control, you're still not free. You're free at someone else's behest. So they can just as easily take it away when the conditions are no longer convenient for you to be able to walk and do and speak and trade with who you want to trade with. How is Bitcoin, like, where does Bitcoin lie in this? Like, in the context of, let's say the internet is the freedom of speech. What really is Bitcoin in kind of the grander picture?
Well, Bitcoin is an attempt to carve out real estate in the monetary conversation. And I think it's a heresy to say we are going to endorse and support a system of monetary rules that is not set by the state, because that's been the default. And the gold standard is a long time ago, 50 years ago. And it wasn't really even popular.
Arguably.
Yeah, it had been degenerating for decades at that point. And Bitcoin is this attempt at a restoration of ideas underlying monetary hardness, exemplified by the gold standard. Additionally, and that's what makes it so interesting, is it's also about individual freedom to transact online, which is kind of orthogonal to the monetary idea, because you can use Bitcoin without knowing anything about the supply schedule. And I'm sure many people do. And it doesn't matter to them whether there's 21 million units or 50 million. And so, that's one of the really interesting things is it's this disruptive idea in many different ways. It's concealable. It's something that dissidents can take with them if they have to flee a country. So the cryptography comes in there. It's a strong form of property rights. It won't be debased. The inflation is clear, and no one's going to change it. You can transact without asking anyone. You can broadcast a transaction. You can verify your assets without asking anyone for permission. So it achieves this multiplicity of objectives, which is, I think, why it's often so hard to reason about from a political perspective.
Yeah. And in the context of like personal responsibility, when you get that ability to verify and you have that singular ownership, it's like if you don't use the tools to protect your freedom, there's, especially being an activist or an advocate for it, if you can't protect yourself, when you're on the plane and the mask comes down, you put yours on so that then you can help other people. And like, that's why I think it's so important to take that individual responsibility, particularly those people who care the most about it, and learn the tools to protect themselves so that they can extend that protection to others. Now I want to if anybody has any questions for Nic, or yes.
I'm coming from Belarus, and the population of the country, average salary is $300 a month, pension $200 a month. So in order to buy current Bitcoin, it probably will take 12 years and 30 years for pensioners. But same time, dictator who runs the country for 27 years is known for using abundant energy to mine Bitcoins. So the question is, how do we, human rights defenders who praise Bitcoin, how to support activists, dissidents, and how dissidents enjoy freedom of Bitcoin, no idea how they do in Belarus because they don't have any money, while dictator is using all of it in order to fight those human rights defenders. Within the last year, 30,000 people got arrested. People are killed, raped, tortured. It's happening in Belarus, in Europe. And we are not talking how we will deal as human rights defenders, as Bitcoin developers, with dictators like that who have all money in the world. So the question is, how?
That's a great question. So the first thing is we can't stop evil people using Bitcoin. And Bitcoin's interesting for that exact reason. We can't strip anyone's ability to use the system out of the system. That's the point of the system. And for Bitcoin to be useful for dissidents, I'll get to your question, the first part in a second. For it to be useful for dissidents, it has to also be something that authoritarian dictators can use if they want to. And we know, outside of Belarus, for instance, we know that the regime in Iran probably mines Bitcoin. The Maduro regime in Venezuela, possibly North Koreans too. There's nothing that the Bitcoin core developers can write into the software to say they can't use Bitcoin. The system strips any notion of identity out of it completely. And so, it doesn't care whether you're a human rights activist or a dictator. So everybody's on the equal playing field. And so, that's just the quality of the system. That's the same with any, functional monetary network, whether it's gold or, physical US dollars or anything like that. Now, regarding how activists can use it, I think, using it at the base layer is probably going to be expensive. But, these new networks have been built on top of it such that you can transact in smaller denominations like Lightning. So I think that, will answer that question with time. But yeah, I mean, to the first question, it's difficult because the dollar is a system that, specifically excludes certain individuals and regimes and things like that. But the exclusionary nature of the dollar is what makes it a not great monetary network too. I'm sure lots of the people in this room have been kicked off the dollar network. And so it doesn't feel great to have a network that anyone can use, whether they're good or evil. But that's what makes for the best networks at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's kind of the heart of the value of Bitcoin, is that it does not know and cannot care about some subjective valuation, because that's where the abuse of power generally comes from, is the subjective valuation or subjective control of one person over another. So to essentially remove that from the equation and give everybody autonomy, as soon as you begin to enter that subjective valuation of, this is a particularly bad person, whether they be a dictator or a government or whatever it is, as soon as you create those exclusionary principles, then the people with the most power and the most influence will use those to then turn right back around and shut out the dissidents. Like, as soon as the element of control and exclusion exist in the protocol, you've kind of lost the level playing field is gone, and the people with the most political and social power will just use it to stomp the people with no political and social power. So, I mean, yeah, exactly like he said, is, Bitcoin cannot exclude. So
money talks. Doesn't matter what world, but money talks, not human rights. So one dictator is controlling 10 million population with no money, and he is using the same tool as human rights defenders. So it means there is no way out of that situation.
Well, what you've got is in the previous system, in like a fiat system, in a government-controlled monetary system, the government is the one that they have total control over the money. There's, by default, a huge gap in the rights between the person, like the rights of the person who controls the money, like the money system, is universal. Money is the tool that we use to do everything in the economy. It's how we achieve everything. Whereas in Bitcoin, it's simply that you cannot exclude that person from also being a part of it, but the common individual has the exact same rights. Like, my wallet protects my Bitcoin and Nic's protects his exactly the same as the leader of Belarus or the president of the United States if they have a wallet. Mine's not any less strong in my ownership of Bitcoin than theirs. And if you had anything else just to add on that.
That's a good answer.
Sorry, let's go to another question here.
So about a year ago, I suggested to Bitcoin Magazine to include Bitcoin DeFi in the conference, the Bitcoin 2021 conference. And the reason I did that was because for the last 5 years, I've been trying to develop a smart contract on top of Bitcoin. And I felt like, most of us in Bitcoin are not aware that that the smart contract has to be a Bitcoin smart contract. It cannot be something else. And eventually, how do you think this is going to happen? How are we going to get there to that smart contract on Bitcoin?
I don't think there's any prohibition on creating more expressivity in the Bitcoin protocol. It's just that, the Bitcoin development culture prioritized safety and security and soundness first. And so it just takes us a little bit longer to get there. But given the volume of hacks and exploits we see on the other more expressive protocols, I think it's pretty warranted to take the safety first approach. So it's not that Bitcoin's the anti-innovation. It's just that it's innovation at the right pace.
Thank you, Nic.